The Lodger by Marie Belloc Lowndes. Chapter 24. Each hour of the days that followed held for Bunting its full meed of aching fear and suspense. The unhappy man was ever debating within himself what course he should pursue, and, according to his mood and to the state of his mind at any particular moment, he would waver between various widely differing lines of action. He told himself again and again, and with fretful unease, that the most awful thing about it all was that he wasn't sure. If only he could have been sure, he might have made up his mind exactly what it was he ought to do. But when telling himself this, he was deceiving himself, and he was vaguely conscious of the fact, for, from Bunting's point of view, almost any alternative would have been preferable to that which to some, nay, perhaps to most, householders would have seemed the only thing to do, namely, to go to the police. But Londoners of Bunting's class have an uneasy fear of the law. To his mind it would be ruin for him and for his Ellen to be mixed up publicly in such a terrible affair. No one concerned in the business would give them and their future a thought, but it would track them to their dying day, and above all, it would make it quite impossible for them ever to get again into a good joint situation. It was that for which Bunting, in his secret soul, now longed with all his heart. No, some other way than going to the police must be found, and he racked his slow brain to find it. The worst of it was that every hour that went by made his future course more difficult and more delicate, and increased the awful weight on his conscience. If only he really knew, if only he could feel quite sure, and then he would tell himself that after all he had very little to go upon, only suspicion, and a secret horrible certainty that his suspicion was justified. And so at last Bunting began to long for a solution which he knew to be indefensible from every point of view. He began to hope, that is, in the depths of his heart, that the lodger would again go out one evening on his horrible business and be caught, red-handed. But far from going out on any business, horrible or other, Mr. Sleuth now never went out at all. He kept upstairs and often spent quite a considerable part of his day in bed. He still felt, so he assured Mrs. Bunting, very far from well. He had never thrown off the chill he had caught on that bitter night he and his landlord had met on their several ways home. Joe Chandler, too, had become a terrible complication to Daisy's father. The detective spent every waking hour that he was not on duty with the Buntings, and Bunting, who at one time had liked him so well and so cordially, now became mortally afraid of him. But though the young man talked of little else in The Avenger, and though on one evening he described at immense length the eccentric-looking gent who had given the barmaid a sovereign, picturing Mr. Sleuth with such awful accuracy that both Bunting and Mrs. Bunting secretly and separately turned sick when they listened to him, he never showed the slightest interest in their lodger. At last there came a morning when Bunting and Chandler held a strange conversation about The Avenger. The young fellow had come in earlier than usual, and just as he arrived, Mrs. Bunting and Daisy were starting out to do some shopping. The girl would fain have stopped behind, but her stepmother had given her a very peculiar, disagreeable look, daring her, so to speak, to be so forward, and Daisy had gone on with a flushed, angry look on her pretty face. And then, as young Chandler stepped through into the sitting-room, it suddenly struck Bunting that the young man looked unlike himself. Indeed, to the ex-butler's apprehension, there was something almost threatening in Chandler's attitude. "I want a word with you, Mr. Bunting," he began abruptly, falteringly, "and I'm glad to have the chance now that Mrs. Bunting and Miss Daisy are out." Bunting braced himself to hear the awful words, the accusation of having sheltered a murderer, the monster whom all the world was seeking under his roof. And then he remembered a phrase, a horrible legal phrase, accessory after the fact. Yes, he had been that. There wasn't any doubt about it. "Yes," he said. "What is it, Joe?" And then the unfortunate man sat down in his chair. "Yes," he said again uncertainly, for young Chandler had now advanced to the table. He was looking at Bunting fixedly. The other thought threateningly. "Well, out with it, Joe. Don't keep me in suspense." And then a slight smile broke over the young man's face. "I don't think what I've got to say can take you by surprise, Mr. Bunting." And Bunting wagged his head in a way that might mean anything, yes or no as the case might be. The two men looked at one another for what seemed a very, very long time to the elder of them. And then, making a great effort, Joe Chandler brought out the words, "Well, I suppose you know what it is I want to talk about." I'm sure Mrs. Bunting would, from a look or two she's lately cast on me. It's your daughter. It's Miss Daisy." And then Bunting gave a kind of cry, twixt a sob and a laugh. "My girl," he cried. "Good Lord, Joe, is that all you wants to talk about? Why, you fair frightened me, that you did." And indeed the relief was so great that the room swam round as he stared across it at his daughter's lover, that lover who was also the embodiment of that now awful thing to him, the law. He smiled rather foolishly at his visitor, and Chandler felt a sharp wave of irritation, of impatience sweep over his good-natured soul. Daisy's father was an old stupid. That's what he was. And then Bunting grew serious. The room ceased to go round. "As far as I am concerned," he said, with a good deal of solemnity, even a little dignity, "you have my blessing, Joe. You're a very likely young chap, and I had a true respect for your father." "Yes," said Chandler, "that's very kind of you, Mr. Bunting. But how about her? Her herself?" Bunting stared at him. It pleased him to think that Daisy hadn't given herself away, as Ellen was always hinting the girl was doing. "I can't answer for Daisy," he said heavily. "You'll have to ask her yourself. That's not a job any other man can do for you, my lad." "I never gets a chance. I never sees her, not by our two selves," said Chandler with some heat. "You don't seem to understand, Mr. Bunting, that I never do see Miss Daisy alone," he repeated. "I hear now that she's going away Monday, and I've only once had the chance of a walk with her. Mrs. Bunting's very particular, not to say pernickety in her ideas, Mr. Bunting." "That's a fault on the right side, that is, with a young girl," said Bunting thoughtfully. And Chandler nodded. He quite agreed that as regarded other young chaps, Mrs. Bunting could not be too particular. "She's been brought up like a lady, my Daisy has," went on Bunting with some pride. "That old aunt of hers hardly lets her out of her sight." "I was coming to the old aunt," said Chandler heavily. "Mrs. Bunting, she talks as if your daughter was going to stay with that old woman the whole of her natural life. Now is that right? That's what I wants to ask you, Mr. Bunting. Is that right?" "I'll say a word to Ellen, don't you fear," said Bunting abstractedly. His mind had wandered off, away from Daisy and this nice young chap, to his now constant anxious preoccupation. "You come along tomorrow," he said, "and I'll see you gets your walk with Daisy. It's only right you and she should have a chance of seeing one another without old folk being by, else how's the girl to tell whether she likes you or not? For the matter of that, you hardly knows her, Joe." He looked at the young man consideringly. Chandler shook his head impatiently. "I knows her quite as well as I wants to know her," he said. "I made up my mind the very first time I seed her, Mr. Bunting." "No, did you really?" said Bunting. "Well, come to think of it, I did so with her mother. Aye, and years after with Ellen, too. But I hope you'll never want no second, Chandler." "God forbid," said the young man under his breath, and then he asked, rather longingly, "Do you think they'll be out long now, Mr. Bunting?" And Bunting woke up to a due sense of hospitality. Sit down, do," he said hastily. "I don't believe they'll be very long. They've only got a little bit of shopping to do." And then, in a changed and a ringing, nervous tone, he asked, "And how about your job, Joe? Nothing new, I take it? I suppose you're all just waiting for the next time?" "Aye, that's about the figure of it." Chandler's voice had also changed. It was now somber, menacing. "We're fair tired of it, beginning to wonder when it'll end, that we are." "Do you ever try and make to yourself a picture of what the master's like?" asked Bunting. Somehow he felt he must ask that. "Yes," said Joe slowly. "I've a sort of notion. A savage, fierce-looking devil, the chap must be. It's that description that was circulated put us wrong. I don't believe it was the man that knocked up against that woman in the fog. No, not one bit I don't. But I wavers. I can't quite make up my mind. Sometimes I think it's a sailor, the foreigner they talks about, that goes away for 8 or 9 days in between, to Holland maybe, or to France. Then again, I says to myself that it's a butcher, a man from the Central Market. Whoever it is, it's someone used to killing, that's flat." "Then it don't seem to you possible." Bunting got up and walked over to the window. "You don't take any stock, I suppose, in that idea some of the papers put out, that the man is—" Then he hesitated and brought out with a gasp, "a gentleman." Chandler looked at him, surprised. "No," he said deliberately. "I've made up my mind that's quite a wrong tack, though I knows that some of our fellows, big pots too, are quite sure that the fellow what gave the girl the sovereign is the man we're looking for. You see, Mr. Bunting, if that's the fact, well, it stands to reason the fellow's an escaped lunatic, and if he's an escaped lunatic, he's got a keeper, and they'd be raising a hue and cry after him, now wouldn't they? You don't think, went on Bunting, lowering his voice, that he could be just staying somewhere, lodging-like? Do you mean that the Avenger may be a toff staying in some West End hotel, Mr. Bunting? Well, things almost as funny as that'd be have come to pass. He smiled as if the notion was a funny one. Yes, something of that sort, muttered Bunting. Well, if your idea is correct, Mr. Bunting. I never said 'twas my idea, said Bunting, all in a hurry. Well, if that idea is correct, then 'twill make our task more difficult than ever. Why, 'twould be looking for a needle in a field of hay, Mr. Bunting. But there, I don't think it's anything quite so unlikely as that. Not myself, I don't. He hesitated. There's some of us, he lowered his voice, that hopes he'll betake himself off, the Avenger, I mean, to another big city, to Manchester or to Edinburgh. There'd be plenty of work for him to do there, and Chandler chuckled at his own grim joke. And then, to both men's secret relief, for Bunting was now mortally afraid of this discussion concerning the Avenger and his doings, they heard Mrs. Bunting's key in the lock. Daisy blushed rosy red with pleasure when she saw that young Chandler was still there. She had feared that when they got home he would be gone, the more so that Ellen, just as if she was doing it on purpose, had lingered aggravatingly long over each small purchase. "Here's Joe come to ask if he can take Daisy out for a walk," ordered out Bunting. "My mother says as how she'd like you to come to tea over at Richmond," said Chandler awkwardly. "I just come in to see whether we could fix it up, Miss Daisy," and Daisy looked imploringly at her stepmother. "Do you mean now, this minute?" asked Mrs. Bunting tartly. "No, of course not," Bunting broke in hastily. "How you do go on, Ellen." "What day did your mother mention would be convenient to her?" asked Mrs. Bunting, looking at the young man satirically. Chandler hesitated. His mother had not mentioned any special day. In fact, his mother had shown a surprising lack of anxiety to see Daisy at all, but he had talked her round. "How about Saturday?" suggested Bunting. "That's Daisy's birthday. 'Twould be a birthday treat for her to go to Richmond, and she's going back to Old Aunt on Monday." "I can't go Saturday," said Chandler disconsolately. "I'm on duty Saturday." "Well, then, let it be Sunday," said Bunting firmly, and his wife looked at him surprised. He seldom asserted himself so much in her presence. "What do you say, Miss Daisy?" said Chandler. "Sunday would be very nice," said Daisy demurely, and then, as the young man took up his hat, and as her stepmother did not stir, Daisy ventured to go out into the hall with him for a minute. Chandler shut the door behind them, and so was spared the hearing of Mrs. Bunting's whispered remark, "When I was a young woman, folk didn't gallivant about on Sunday. Those who was courting used to go to church together, decent-like." End of chapter 24. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Lodger by Marie Belloc Lowndes. Chapter 25. Daisy's 18th birthday dawned uneventfully. Her father gave her what he had always promised she should have on her 18th birthday, a watch. It was a pretty little silver watch which Bunting had bought second-hand on the last day he had been happy. It seemed a long, long time ago now. Mrs. Bunting thought a silver watch a very extravagant present, but she was far too wretched, far too absorbed in her own thoughts to trouble much about it. Besides, in such matters she had generally had the good sense not to interfere between her husband and his child. In the middle of the birthday morning Bunting went out to buy himself some more tobacco. He had never smoked so much as in the last 4 days, excepting perhaps the week that had followed on his leaving service. Smoking a pipe had then held all the exquisite pleasure which we are told attaches itself to the eating of forbidden fruit. His tobacco had now become his only relaxation. It acted on his nerves as an opiate, soothing his fears and helping him to think. But he had been overdoing it, and it was that which now made him feel so jumpy, so he assured himself, when he found himself starting at any casual sound outside, or even when his wife spoke to him suddenly. Just now Ellen and Daisy were down in the kitchen, and Bunting didn't quite like the sensation of knowing that there was only one pair of stairs between Mr. Sleuth and himself. So he quietly slipped out of the house without telling Ellen that he was going out. In the last 4 days Bunting had avoided his usual haunts. Above all, he had avoided even passing the time of day to his acquaintances and neighbors. He feared, with a great fear, that they would talk to him of a subject which, because it filled his mind to the exclusion of all else, might make him betray the knowledge. No, not knowledge, rather the suspicion that dwelt within him. But today the unfortunate man had a curious, instinctive longing for human companionship. Companionship, that is, other than that of his wife and of his daughter. This longing for a change of company finally led him into a small, populous thoroughfare hard by the Edgware Road. There were more people there than usual just now, for the housewives of the neighborhood were doing their Saturday marketing for Sunday. The ex-butler turned into a small, old-fashioned shop where he generally bought his tobacco. Bunting passed the time of day with the tobacconist, and the two fell into desultory talk, but to his customer's relief and surprise, the man made no allusion to the subject of which all the neighborhood must still be talking. And then, quite suddenly, while still standing by the counter, and before he had paid for the packet of tobacco he held in his hand, Bunting, through the open door, saw with horrified surprise that Ellen, his wife, was standing alone outside a greengrocer's shop just opposite. Muttering a word of apology, he rushed out of the shop and across the road. "Ellen," he gasped hoarsely, "you've never gone and left my little girl alone in the house with the lodger?" Mrs. Bunting's face went yellow with fear. "I thought you was indoors," she cried. "You was indoors. Whatever made you come out for, without first making sure I'd stay in?" Bunting made no answer, but as they stared at each other in exasperated silence, each now knew that the other knew. They turned and scurried down the crowded street. "Don't run," he said suddenly. "We shall get there just as quickly if we walk fast. People are noticing you, Ellen. Don't run." He spoke breathlessly, but it was breathlessness induced by fear and by excitement, not by the quick pace at which they were walking. At last they reached their own gate, and Bunting pushed past in front of his wife. After all, Daisy was his child. Ellen couldn't know how he was feeling. He seemed to take the path in one leap, then fumbled for a moment with his latchkey. Opening wide the door, "Daisy," he called out in a wailing voice. "Daisy, my dear, where are you?" "Here I am, father. What is it?" "She's all right." Bunting turned a gray face to his wife. "She's all right, Ellen." He waited a moment, leaning against the wall of the passage. "It did give me a turn," he said, and then warningly, "Don't frighten the girl, Ellen." Daisy was standing before the fire in their sitting room, admiring herself in the glass. "Oh, father," she exclaimed without turning round, "I've seen the lodger. He's quite a nice gentleman, though to be sure he does look a cure. He rang his bell, but I didn't like to go up, and so he came down to ask Ellen for something. We had quite a nice little chat, that we had. I told him it was my birthday, and he asked me and Ellen to go to Madame Tussaud's with him this afternoon." She laughed, a little self-consciously. "Of course, I could see he was eccentric, and then at first he spoke so funnily. 'And who be you?' he says, threatening-like, and I says to him, 'I'm Mr. Bunting's daughter, sir.' 'Then you're a very fortunate girl,' that's what he says, Ellen, 'to 'ave such a nice stepmother as you've got. That's why,' he says, 'you look such a good innocent girl.' And then he quoted a bit of the prayer book. 'Keep innocency,' he says, wagging his head at me. Lord, it made me feel as if I was with old Aunt again. I won't have you going out with a lodger. That's flat." Bunting spoke in a muffled, angry tone. He was wiping his forehead with one hand, while with the other he mechanically squeezed the little packet of tobacco, for which, as he now remembered, he had forgotten to pay. Daisy pouted. "Oh, father, I think you might let me have a treat on my birthday. I told him that Saturday wasn't a very good day, at least so I'd heard, for Madame Tussaud's. Then he said we could go early, while the fine folk are still having their dinners." She turned to her stepmother, then giggled happily. "He particularly said you was to come, too. The lodger has a wonderful fancy for you, Ellen. If I was father, I'd feel quite jealous." Her last words were cut across by a tap-tap on the door. Bunting and his wife looked at each other apprehensively. Was it possible that, in their agitation, they had left the front door open, and that someone, some merciless myrmidon of the law, had crept in behind them? Both felt a curious thrill of satisfaction when they saw that it was only Mr. Sleuth. Mr. Sleuth dressed for going out. The tall hat he had worn when he had first come to them was in his hand, but he was wearing a coat instead of his Inverness cape. "I heard you come in," he addressed Mrs. Bunting in his high, whistling, hesitating voice, "and so I've come down to ask you if you and Miss Bunting will come to Madame Tussaud's now. I have never seen those famous waxworks, though I've heard of the place all my life. As Bunting forced himself to look fixedly at his lodger, a sudden doubt bringing with it a sense of immeasurable relief came to Mr. Sleuth's landlord. Surely it was inconceivable that this gentle, mild-mannered gentleman could be the monster of cruelty and cunning that Bunting had now for the terrible space of 4 days believed him to be. He tried to catch his wife's eye, but Mrs. Bunting was looking away, staring into vacancy. She still, of course, wore the bonnet and cloak in which she had just been out to do her marketing. Daisy was already putting on her hat and coat. "Well," said Mr. Sleuth. Then Mrs. Bunting turned, and it seemed to his landlady that he was looking at her threateningly. "Well?" "Yes, sir, we'll come in a minute," she said dully. End of chapter 25. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Lodger by Marie Belloc Lowndes. Chapter 26. Madame Tussaud's had hitherto held pleasant memories for Mrs. Bunting. In the days when she and Bunting were courting, they often spent there part of their afternoon out. The butler had an acquaintance, a man named Hopkins, who was one of the waxworks staff, and this man had sometimes given him passes for self and lady. But this was the first time Mrs. Bunting had been inside the place since she had come to live almost next door, as it were, to the big building. They walked in silence to the familiar entrance, and then, after the ill-assorted trio had gone up the great staircase and into the first gallery, Mr. Sleuth suddenly stopped short. The presence of those curious, still, waxen figures which suggest so strangely death and life seemed to surprise and affright him. Daisy took quick advantage of the lodger's hesitation and unease. "Oh, Ellen," she cried, "do let us begin by going into the Chamber of Horrors. I've never been in there. Old Aunt made Father promise he wouldn't take me the only time I've ever been here, but now that I'm 18 I can do just as I like. Besides, Old Aunt will never know." Mr. Sleuth looked down at her, and a smile passed for a moment over his worn, gaunt face. "Yes," he said, "let us go into the Chamber of Horrors. That's a good idea, Miss Bunting. I've always wanted to see the Chamber of Horrors." They turned into the great room in which the Napoleonic relics were then kept, and which led into the curious, vault-like chamber where waxen effigies of dead criminals stand grouped in wooden docks. Mrs. Bunting was at once disturbed and relieved to see her husband's old acquaintance, Mr. Hopkins, in charge of the turnstile admitting the public to the Chamber of Horrors. "Well, you are a stranger," the man observed genially. "I do believe that this is the very first time I've seen you in here, Mrs. Bunting, since you was married." "Yes," she said, "that is so. And this is my husband's daughter, Daisy. I expect you've heard of her, Mr. Hopkins. And this," she hesitated a moment, "is our lodger, Mr. Sleuth." But Mr. Sleuth frowned and shuffled away. Daisy, leaving her stepmother's side, joined him. 2, as all the world knows, is company. 3 is none. Mrs. Bunting put down 3 sixpences. "Wait a minute," said Hopkins. "You can't go into the Chamber of Horrors just yet. But you won't have to wait more than 4 or 5 minutes, Mrs. Bunting. It's this way, you see. Our boss is in there showing a party round." He lowered his voice. "It's Sir John Burney. I suppose you know who Sir John Burney is?" "No," she answered indifferently. "I don't know that I ever heard of him." She felt slightly, oh very slightly, uneasy about Daisy. She would have liked her stepdaughter to keep well within sight and sound, but Mr. Sleuth was now taking the girl down to the other end of the room. "Well, I hope you never will know him, not in any personal sense, Mrs. Bunting." The man chuckled. "He's the Commissioner of Police, the new one. That's what Sir John Burney is. One of the gentlemen he's showing round our place is the Paris police boss, whose job is on all fours, so to speak, with Sir John's. The Frenchie has brought his daughter with him, and there are several other ladies. Ladies always likes horrors, Mrs. Bunting. That's our experience here. Oh, take me to the Chamber of Horrors. That's what they say the minute they gets into this here building." Mrs. Bunting looked at him thoughtfully. It occurred to Mr. Hopkins that she was very wan and tired. She used to look better in the old days when she was still in service, before Bunting married her. "Yes," she said. "That's just what my stepdaughter said just now. Oh, take me to the Chamber of Horrors. That's exactly what she did say when we got upstairs." A group of people, all talking and laughing together, were advancing from within the wooden barrier toward the turnstile. Mrs. Bunting stared at them nervously. She wondered which of them was the gentleman with whom Mr. Hopkins had hoped she would never be brought into personal contact. She thought she could pick him out among the others. He was a tall, powerful, handsome gentleman with a military appearance. Just now he was smiling down into the face of a young lady. "Monsieur Barbaroux was quite right," he was saying in a loud, cheerful voice. "Our English law is too kind to the criminal, especially to the murderer. If we conducted our trials in the French fashion, the place we have just left would be very much fuller than it is today. A man of whose guilt we are absolutely assured is oftener than not acquitted, and then the public taunt us with another undiscovered crime." "Do you mean, Sir John, that murderers sometimes escape scot-free? Take the man who has been committing all these awful murders this last month. I suppose there's no doubt he'll be hanged, if he's ever caught, that is." Her girlish voice rang out, and Mrs. Bunting could hear every word that was said. The whole party gathered round, listening eagerly. "Well, no," he spoke very deliberately. "I doubt if that particular murderer ever will be hanged." "You mean that you'll never catch him?" The girl spoke with a touch of airy impertinence in her clear voice. "I think we shall end by catching him, because—" He waited a moment, then added in a lower voice, "Now don't give me away to a newspaper fellow, Miss Rose, because now I think we do know who the murderer in question is." Several of those standing nearby uttered expressions of surprise and incredulity. "Then why don't you catch him?" cried the girl indignantly. "I didn't say we knew where he was. I only said we knew who he was, or rather, perhaps I ought to say that I personally have a very strong suspicion of his identity." Sir John's French colleague looked up quickly. "De Leipzig and Liverpool man?" he said interrogatively. The other nodded. "Yes, I suppose you've had the case turned up." Then, speaking very quickly, as if he wished to dismiss the subject from his own mind and from that of his auditors, he went on. 4 murders of the kind were committed 8 years ago, 2 in Leipzig, the others just afterwards in Liverpool, and there were certain peculiarities connected with the crimes which made it clear they were committed by the same hand. The perpetrator was caught, fortunately for us, red-handed, just as he was leaving the house of his last victim, for in Liverpool the murder was committed in a house. I myself saw the unhappy man. I say unhappy, for there is no doubt at all that he was mad. He hesitated and added in a lower tone, suffering from an acute form of religious mania. I myself saw him, as I say, at some length. But now comes the really interesting point. I have just been informed that a month ago this criminal lunatic, as we must of course regard him, made his escape from the asylum where he was confined. He arranged the whole thing with extraordinary cunning and intelligence, and we should probably have caught him long ago, were it not that he managed, when on his way out of the place, to annex a considerable sum of money in gold, with which the wages of the asylum staff were about to be paid. It is owing to that fact that his escape was very wrongly concealed." He stopped abruptly, as if sorry he had said so much, and a moment later the party were walking in Indian file through the turnstile, Sir John Burney leading the way. Mrs. Bunting looked straight before her. She felt, so she expressed it to her husband later, as if she had been turned to stone. Even had she wished to do so, she had neither the time nor the power to warn her lodger of his danger, for Daisy and her companion were now coming down the room, bearing straight for the Commissioner of Police. In another moment Mrs. Bunting's lodger and Sir John Burney were face to face. Mr. Sleuth swerved to one side. There came a terrible change over his pale, narrow face. It became discomposed, livid with rage and terror. But, to Mrs. Bunting's relief, yes, to her inexpressible relief, Sir John Burney and his friend swept on. They passed Mr. Sleuth and the girl by his side, unaware, or so it seemed to her, that there was anyone else in the room but themselves. "Hurry up, Mrs. Bunting," said the turnstile keeper. "You and your friends will have the place all to yourselves for a bit." From an official he had become a man, and it was the man of Mr. Hopkins that gallantly addressed pretty Daisy Bunting. "It seems strange that a young lady like you should want to go in and see all those horrible frights," he said jestingly. "Mrs. Bunting, may I trouble you to come over here for a moment?" The words were hissed rather than spoken by Mr. Sleuth's lips. His landlady took a doubtful step towards him. "A last word with you, Mrs. Bunting." The lodger's face was still distorted with fear and passion. "Do not think to escape the consequences of your hideous treachery. I trusted you, Mrs. Bunting, and you betrayed me. But I am protected by a higher power, for I still have much to do." Then, his voice sinking to a whisper, he hissed out, "Your end will be bitter as wormwood and sharp as a 2-edged sword. Your feet shall go down to death, and your steps take hold on hell. Even while Mr. Sleuth was muttering these strange, dreadful words, he was looking round, glancing this way and that, seeking a way of escape. At last his eyes became fixed on a small placard placed above a curtain. "Emergency exit" was written there. Mrs. Bunting thought he was going to make a dash for the place, but Mr. Sleuth did something very different. Leaving his landlady's side, he walked over to the turnstile. He fumbled in his pocket for a moment, and then touched the man on the arm. "I feel ill," he said, speaking very rapidly. "Very ill indeed. It is the atmosphere of this place. I want you to let me out by the quickest way. It would be a pity for me to faint here, especially with ladies about." His left hand shot out and placed what he had been fumbling for in his pocket on the other's bare palm. "I see there's an emergency exit over there. Would it be possible for me to get out that way?" "Well, yes, sir, I think so." The man hesitated. He felt a very slight feeling of misgiving. He looked at Daisy, flushed and smiling, happy and unconcerned, and then at Mrs. Bunting. She was very pale, but surely her lodger's sudden seizure was enough to make her feel worried. Hopkins felt the half-sovereign pleasantly tickling his palm. The Paris prefect of police had given him only half a crown. Mean, shabby foreigner. "Yes, sir, I can let you out that way," he said at last, "and perhaps when you're standing out in the air on the iron balcony you'll feel better. But then you know, sir, you'll have to come round to the front if you wants to come in again, for those emergency doors only open outward." "Yes, yes," said Mr. Sleuth hurriedly. "I quite understand. If I feel better I'll come in by the front way and pay another shilling. That's only fair." "You needn't do that if you'll just explain what happened here." The man went and pulled the curtain aside and put his shoulder against the door. It burst open, and the light, for a moment, blinded Mr. Sleuth. He passed his hand over his eyes. "Thank you," he muttered. "Thank you. I shall get all right out there." An iron stairway led down into a small stable yard, of which the door opened into a side street. Mr. Sleuth looked round once more. He really did feel very ill and dazed. How pleasant it would be to take a flying leap over the balcony railing and find rest, eternal rest, below. But no, he thrust the thought, the temptation, from him. Again a convulsive look of rage came over his face. He had remembered his landlady. How could the woman whom he had treated so generously have betrayed him to his archenemy, to the official, that is, who had entered into a conspiracy years ago to have him confined? Him, an absolutely sane man with a great avenging work to do in the world, in a lunatic asylum. He stepped out into the open air, and the curtain, falling to behind him, blotted out the tall, thin figure from the little group of people who had watched him disappear. Even Daisy felt a little scared. "He did look bad, didn't he now?" She turned appealingly to Mr. Hopkins. "Yes, that he did, poor gentleman. Your lodger, too?" He looked sympathetically at Mrs. Bunting. She moistened her lips with her tongue. "Yes," she repeated dully. "My lodger." End of chapter 26. Recording by Leanne Howlett.